Hi, this is Adam Hertzman. I'm the Director of Marketing for Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. Welcome to the Jewish Federation's presentation of the 2017 Greater Pittsburgh Jewish Community Study. I'm here with Matt Boxer, who is one of the directors of the research from the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University. And with that, take it away, Matt.
Thank you. So, community study is a very complicated piece of research, and I don't want to take up too much of people's time today. But let me preface everything I'm going to say by saying that there's an awful lot of detail in here, and we're going to try to share with you some of the highlights from each of the different areas of the survey. For much greater detail, we recommend that you pick up the main report. It's a little under 100 pages. And if you really want the excruciating detail, pick up the methodological appendices as well, with another couple hundred pages of every single detail you could possibly want to know about the research. Adam, if you could advance the slide. So first, you should know a little something about how we collected the data. This was a representative survey a representative sample survey, I should say, of the Greater Pittsburgh Jewish community. We had over 81,000 unique households on a list frame that we compiled from organizations' membership and mailing lists, as well as an ethnic names frame to help us identify people who were Jewish and lived in the community but were not affiliated in any way. Over 1,200 households completed the survey in our primary sample. We also had a secondary or supplementary sample where nearly 900 households completed the survey. In total, over 2,100 Jewish households who live in Greater Pittsburgh for at least part of the year participated in the survey, and it's based on their data that all of the data that follow were compiled. Next slide. We came up with a population estimate of 49,200 Jews in Greater Pittsburgh. Makes Pittsburgh roughly the 32nd largest Jewish community in the United States based on Federation catchment area. The population estimate includes 42,800 Jewish adults and 6,400 children who are being raised as Jews. There are an additional almost 10,000 individuals who do not identify as Jewish living in Jewish households. The Jewish population grew by about 17% since your last study, but the number of children declined, and we'll talk a little bit about the demographics of the community in slides that are coming up. Here you see the geographic distribution of the Jewish community. The map shows, if you see those tiny pink dots located throughout the area, each one of those represents 50 households. The dots are randomly placed within the zip codes where those households live. And you can see that the households are very heavily concentrated, especially in Squirrel Hill, which is home to 26% of all Jewish households in Greater Pittsburgh, but also the rest of the East End as well. Most of the 31% of Jewish households that live in the city of Pittsburgh but outside of Squirrel Hill are in the East End. You also have substantial population in the South Hills and in the North Hills. And the rest of the region included 14% of Jewish households, much less densely populated outside of these few key areas, but still a substantial chunk of your local Jewish population there. The distribution by age is shown here. And as you can see, almost half of the children in the community are being raised in Squirrel Hill, about a third in the suburbs, which includes the rest of the region outside of the North Hills and the South Hills. Older adults are more likely to live in the suburbs. Over half of the population that's 50 to 64 years old live out in the suburbs. And 38% of your senior citizens, those 65 and older, live in the suburbs, compared to a third in Squirrel Hill. Moving on, the denominational breakdown of the Greater Pittsburgh Jewish community is pretty similar to the U.S. Jewish community as a whole. You have slightly more Orthodox, slightly fewer conservative and Reform, fairly similar number of people who identify as secular or just Jewish. They have no particular denomination. The age breakdown is somewhat similar to the U.S. as a whole. You have a bit fewer young adults, those 18 to 34, and a bit more senior citizens, those 65 and older. 61% of households in the Jewish community identify that say they have at least one married couple living in the household. 18% of households have children in them. That's down from 30% in 2002. And that's a reflection of the age distribution of the adults. You just don't have very many people in their 30s and 40s who are raising children. The intermarriage rate is 44%, which is slightly lower than the national average, but again, that's a function of the age. Here you see some information about how children are being raised, both in households where both parents are Jewish and in households where there's an intermarriage, where one parent is Jewish and the other is not. In households where both parents are Jewish, 99% of the children are being raised exclusively Jewish, 86% by religion, 13% culturally Jewish. That is, the religion they don't practice is Judaism, but they identify strongly culturally. And another 1% have not, they're not raising their children in any religion, or they haven't decided yet. Among families that are intermarried, the numbers are very different. Only 1/3 of the children are being raised exclusively Jewish. 11% are being raised Jewish and another religion, typically Christianity. And 6% are being raised in a religion other than Judaism, again, typically Christianity. Now, these numbers are lower, the proportion who are being raised Jewish or Jewish in something else, than we see nationally. Nationally, the rate who are being raised Jewish in some way is about 60%. But the missing half here is where you have an opportunity. 43% of the children of interfaith parents are being raised in no religion, and 8% are being raised such that their parents haven't decided yet whether the kids will be Jewish or not. And the trick with these kids is you really have to get them into high-quality Jewish educational programs. If you do, they are very likely to identify as Jews when they become adults, and they'll be more likely to come seek out your programs. Next slide, synagogues. So synagogue membership is declining all over the map, and Pittsburgh is no exception. In 2002, a little over half of your households said they were members of a synagogue. Today, it's about a third, it's 35%. And of those 35%, not all are members of what we refer to as brick and mortar dues-paying model synagogues. That is, they have their own building, and their membership structure is based on paying traditional dues. More and more these days, people are belonging to other kinds of congregations, either a brick and mortar synagogue where you don't have to pay dues, or an independent minyan or chavurah. And Chabad is particularly strong in the Pittsburgh area. 7% of synagogue member households say that they belong to Chabad. Religiously speaking, this is not an especially religious community, but it's pretty normal. Over 3/4 have attended services at some point in the past year. About half attended the high holiday services, and about 1/4 attend services at least once a month. Advancing to the next slide. Pittsburgh Jews are much more likely to have traveled to Israel than American Jews as a whole. The 2013 Pew study showed that 43% of American Jews had been to Israel. It's 5 years later. Today, the number is pretty close to 50%. But in Pittsburgh, the number is 59%. 33% of Pittsburgh area Jews say they feel very connected to Israel. Another 30% say they feel somewhat connected. And about 1/4 can identify Carmiel Misgav as your partnership region. Some number of others are aware that there is a partnership region but can't identify it. And we feel that this presents an opportunity for both promoting all the things that you do with Carmiel Misgav and getting more people to get involved with Israel, possibly even getting people to go on a mission to Israel should you choose to sponsor one, which I know you do occasionally. It's also worth noting that of people who are age eligible, that is people who at the time were eligible to apply to a Birthright Israel trip, 40% have actually gone on a Birthright trip. And that represents 9% of your total adult population. There's nearly 1 in 10 adults in your community, of all adults in your community, have gone on a Birthright Israel trip. And that's just remarkable. Now, Jewish communities tend to be pretty affluent, certainly much more affluent than their neighbors. And in Pittsburgh, it's clear that the Jewish community is a little more affluent than the community as a whole, but it's not a huge difference. The Jewish community in Pittsburgh is solidly middle class. Most people are pretty comfortable. 7% of households say that they're prosperous. 26% say they're living very comfortably. Nearly half say that they're reasonably comfortable. But you have 15% who say they're just getting along, and 7% who say they're nearly poor, 1% who say they're poor. So 1 in 4 households are just getting along, nearly poor, or poor. So while the stereotype is that Jews are very affluent, and certainly the Jewish community of Greater Pittsburgh is more affluent than the community in general, it's important to remember that you have roughly 1 in 4 households are struggling and might need a little bit of help. And on this slide, we highlight some of the specific ways they indicate that they're struggling. You have 1 in 4 households say that they have insufficient savings for 3 months. If, God forbid, someone lost a job, they don't have enough savings to pay their bills for 3 months. 13% of households say that they skipped a rent, mortgage, or utility bill in the past year because they couldn't afford to pay it. 13% of households say that if they had a $400 emergency expense, say their car broke down, they wouldn't be able to pay it immediately with cash, money in the bank, or on a credit card that they could pay off immediately. 6% say they're receiving public benefits like SNAP, Medicaid, subsidized housing, or daycare assistance. Now, some of these are not necessarily indicators of poverty, but they're absolutely indicators of potential vulnerability to poverty. And 4% of households said that they were unable to participate in Jewish life in some way because of their finances. And here we have a couple of quotes taken directly from the survey from people who talked about that. We cover our expenses, but we don't have any extra. We'd love to join the JCC and take part in programs, but we don't have the money. A lot of people talked about not having enough money to pay for dues to the JCC or to a local synagogue or to pay for fees for different kinds of programs, and they could use a little bit of help. Now, one of the things that we do to try to break down exactly what's going on in the community is we use a statistical technique called latent class analysis to get at patterns of Jewish engagement. Now, it used to be that you could just ask somebody what their denomination was and you could predict the different ways that they're engaged in Jewish life. That's not the case anymore. I won't go into too much detail on this. Rami has a lot more information he can share with you. If you're interested, I'm of course always happy to answer questions, and there's a lot more about this in the report. But these are the 5 patterns of behavior that we found based on 15 Jewish behaviors that we write about extensively in the report. You can see that we found 16% of Jewish adults in the community are immersed, that is, they're highly engaged in all aspects of Jewish life. Another 29% fit what we call the connected pattern. They're highly engaged in most aspects of Jewish life. 29% are what we called involved. They're very active in Jewish organizations, but they're not particularly religious. They don't get involved in synagogues or religious rituals. 12% are what we called holiday Jews. They participate in holiday observances. A fair number of them are members of synagogues, not for the various kinds of programs that synagogues offer, but to help them celebrate Jewish holidays. And 13% are minimally involved. These are the people with little or no involvement in Jewish life, even in private, at home, or with their families. So I mentioned that you used to be able to predict people's behavior based on denomination. Here you see we've broken down denomination by engagement pattern, and you see that most groups exist across all engagement patterns. There are no Orthodox Jews, that is, there are no people who identify as Orthodox who are minimally involved in the Jewish community, but there are Orthodox Jews in each of the other 4 engagement groups. And for conservative, Reform, other denominations, and people who identify as secular or cultural, that is, they have no specific denomination, there are people in each and every one of the engagement groups. So it's helpful to remember, again, denomination does not necessarily predict behavior, it doesn't necessarily predict engagement in Jewish life. These engagement patterns are based on what people actually do and not the labels that they call themselves. Nobody on the survey called themselves immersed, connected, involved, holiday, or minimally involved. They called themselves Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and so on. But based on their behavior, but based on what they actually do, we put them into these different categories. And we think these categories are very helpful if you're trying to design engagement efforts. How are you going to attract people in these different groups? You need a different strategy for engaging, for example, the holiday Jews than you do for the connected Jews. Next slide. So we've also broken down the engagement groups by age. The stereotype is that young adults are not at all involved. And it turns out in Pittsburgh, the stereotype is very much not true. The youngest adults, those 18 to 34, were the most likely to end up in the immersed category. That is, they are the most actively involved in the Jewish community. And they were the least likely to end up in the minimally involved category. That is, the people who have no formal involvement in the Jewish community and don't really do much on their own either. Part of this is that you have an awful lot of young adults living in and near Squirrel Hill, where it's very easy to get them involved in the Jewish community because all of your institutions are right there. That certainly gives Pittsburgh an advantage that a lot of other Jewish communities don't have. But I think you also have a unique crop of young adults here. This is just a group that is very interested in Jewish life in lots of different ways, and they might not be involved in the same organizations as their parents would if they lived in, or do live in Pittsburgh, but they're involved in their own ways. Next slide. So where do people live? Geography and Jewish engagement. As you might expect, the people who are most involved in the Jewish community tend to be the people who live in closest proximity to the Jewish organizations. Squirrel Hill has the highest share of people who are immersed or connected. The rest of Pittsburgh, which again mostly consisted of areas either adjacent to Squirrel Hill or just a couple of zip codes away from it, has the next highest share of people in the immersed and connected categories. South Hills has the highest number of people who are minimally involved. Now, this is not a reflection on anything that South Hills is doing wrong. They seem to be doing everything pretty well. It just so happens that South Hills is where an awful lot of people who happen to be Jewish but don't do a lot of Jewish things live. And from what I've heard, it's likely that they live in the South Hills because there are strong school districts there. And if they want to raise their children and give them a good education, but they don't happen to be particularly involved in Jewish life, that's where they're going to live, in the South Hills. Next slide. So I have very, very quickly taken you through a lot of material. There's a tremendous amount of detail in the report. The report is available on the Cohen Center website. It's also available on the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh website. The public use data set is also now available. So if any of you are familiar with statistical computing programs, we have a data set that can be downloaded in Stata, and feel free to play with the data to your heart's content. We have the full report, the comparison chart and appendices that have detailed breakdowns that don't appear in the report. We have a number of other appendices as well. Just a tremendous amount of detail in here. It's a very rich source of data. Although we went over everything with a fine-tooth comb, there are many things that we just couldn't report, either because there wasn't room or because it was getting a little too detailed. But almost anything you could want to know about the Jewish community of Greater Pittsburgh, as long as we have enough data to do reliable statistical analyses, it's in there somewhere. So finally, I would like to thank everyone who was involved, the members of the Study Advisory Committee who provided invaluable insight into the community to help us shape the survey instrument. The organizations provided contact information without which we would have had a much more difficult time reaching people to do the survey. And of course, the 2,111 households that completed the survey, none of this would have been possible without them.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that overview. I'm going to unmute everybody at the moment. Just a note, you can also use the chat with the chat button at the bottom of your screen if you're interested in asking questions. So everybody is unmuted at the moment, and if you're interested in asking questions at this time, we'd be happy to take questions. Anybody online who's still on the call who's interested in asking questions at this time?
Hi, this is Tinsy from the JAA.
Hi there, do you have a question?
I do. Matt, I know you provided us with some data that was of the 75 plus age bracket because, 65 plus as a demographic can be sort of general. So, and I'm able to get into the system and look at that data as well now, instead of, because I think I have it on like a paper source that was given to my CEO. So is that possible now that I can go in there and sort of look and cross-reference, answers from the 75 plus to, sort of manipulate myself?
I believe that's possible now. Ramy, did we send you the file for that?
Yes, I have the Excel file is available.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And I can just do that, Ramy, by going on to your site,
Well,
Federation?
No, I believe you're asking about the public use data set, correct?
Yes.
So that I'll throw back to you, Matt. Is that something that we would be able to look at through the public use data set?
Certainly, yes. It would be possible to analyze it through the public use data set. The trick with the data set, of course, is you have to be familiar with statistical computing to be able to get anything out of it. We can provide a data set in SPSS if that's preferable to Stata, but to really get accurate results, you have to have a program that works with complex statistical weights. Excel doesn't do that.
Okay.
For Excel, what you could do is we could basically take those comparison charts and split out the 65 to 74 and the 75 plus. I think we have a file floating around with that.
Yeah.
And that we can provide to you. If the Federation doesn't have that already from us, I'm not sure if we ever sent something like that. If we didn't, we should, and we'll make that publicly available.
Thanks,
That's
Matt.
great. Thank you.
I will,
Thank you.
And thanks so much for your question, Tinsy. I'll mention as well, this is Adam Hertzman. I'm Director of Marketing. The Jewish Federation is absolutely here to help. There are Ramy's available, and there are other planners at Jewish Federation who are available to help other Jewish organizations in Pittsburgh to interpret the data and to use the data to whatever extent that you need to. The data exists not just to tell us, what's happening about the Jewish future, about the Jewish community now, but also to help plan for the future. And we're absolutely available to help where needed with those organizations. Other questions that folks on the phone have about anything that you've seen or other areas of the study? Well, with that, I think I will wrap up. Again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact Rami Rubin. You can contact him at rubin@jfedpgh.org, or call the Jewish Federation directly. We're happy to put you in touch with people who might be able to answer your questions. Thanks so much, Matt, and thank you to everybody who participated in the call today.